Hello, hola. I just wanted to share this talk that I did for the Ocean Geographic Live fundraiser for Cuba recently. It was a 3 to 4 hour fundraiser run by Ocean Geographic, raising funds for the Guardians of the Queen, the dive staff in Cuba. And this was my contribution to it. Knowing lots of other photographers, we're going to talk about the big animal action that's possible out there for underwater photography and diving. I focused a little bit more on the reefs and particularly the macro subjects that I love to shoot out there. Having pre-recorded my section because the fundraiser was in the middle of the night, my time, I thought I would put the pre-recorded section up on YouTube to share long term. Hope you enjoy it. Hello everyone, this is Alex Mustard. I'm afraid I'm pre-recorded because this is going out right in the middle of the night here in the UK, and I thought, and so I'm appearing, but I really wanted to be part of it, so I've sent in a recorded video of a few of my Cuba highlights. This is a picture of me in Havana with my daughter Isa. It's one of the reasons I want to have a good night's sleep, because if I stay up all night recording this, she'll be certain to wake up at 4 in the morning wanting to get up and start her day. But I really wanted to be part of this because Cuba is a really special place in my heart, and I really wanted to share some of my thoughts photographically of what the Jardines de la Reina, the Gardens of the Queen, offer to photographers. But before that, most trips to Cuba start and finish in Havana, and it really is the most phenomenal city to visit. So full of life, so full of energy, so full of character, and completely different to anywhere else I've visited in the world. So if you've never had the chance to visit Cuba or Havana, even if you're not a scuba diver, I'd really encourage you to go there. But we're here to talk about our Cuban friends, and particularly those of us who've been to the Gardens of the Queen and dived there have made many good friends with the Cuban dive masters and the Cuban staff that make you feel so welcome in this amazing place. And I really wanted to talk on behalf of them and share some of my photos. Now, the thing that draws most of us photographers to Cuba is, of course, the big animals, the chance to see these. But I'm sure everyone's going to be showing you lots of pictures of crocodiles, the fact that there are an amazing population of silky sharks in the area, really, really phenomenal sharks to spend time with, elegantly proportioned, beautiful, gentle, but voracious animals. There's also reef sharks, and I think what amazes me about Cuba is the fact that just about every single dive site that you visit in the Gardens of the Queen, you see reef sharks, and they're fantastic to see that. There's also the whole plethora of bigger creatures on the reefs. There's huge numbers of groupers on every dive site. And that's something that, it shouldn't be remarkable, but it is, because just about everywhere else in the world, these big animals are fished out, and these big animals reproduce slowly, so they don't bounce back instantly. This is a Goliath grouper, a black grouper, probably the most common big grouper that you see on the reefs in Cuba, and Nassau groupers, very, very pretty fish, one of my favourites to shoot out there. The reason that Cuban reefs are so special for me, though, is that they have been properly protected for almost 25 years now, and weren't exactly overexploited before then. So it's a real chance to dive back in time and see the Caribbean reef ecosystem as it could be in other places, as it should be in other places, and how it was. To see reefs packed with lush, healthy coral growth. I love the colour palette of Caribbean reefs with the beiges and browns and golds of the fish and the soft corals. These are sea rods here and some sea plumes on the picture, mixed in with a group of mixed group of grunts. There's white grunts here, which are the ones without the dark marks on the tail, and blue striped grunts as well, mixing together. The grunts are kind of like the sweet lips of the Caribbean. They're kind of related to those nocturnal hunters that gather in schools in the day and spread out at night. But they're not quite as friendly as sweet lips to shoot, so there was a bit more of a challenge to get them nicely lined up in the picture. The moment you even glance in their direction, they start making messy shapes. So they're always fun to try and shoot. But what I love about the Cuban reefs, these are schoolmaster snappers and a Caribbean reef shark, is that they're just packed with life. They remind you of how reefs should be. And I think as divers, we can often make the mistake of going to visit a very beautiful coral reef, be amazed by its beauty, and think, wow, it couldn't be any better than that. But actually, when coral reefs lack big fish, lack the big snappers, the big groupers, the big sharks, and things, they're not properly healthy reefs. And just because the place is beautiful, because it's covered in nice coral and lots of small fish, doesn't mean it's the way it should be. And one of the great things about Cuba is it allows us to reset what we should be accepting as being beauty, as being normal, as being pristine, and getting to experience that. And perhaps that's most true in terms of coral growth. Caribbean reefs generally across the region only have about 20 to 30% coral cover on a normal healthy reef. And that's because Caribbean reefs have already suffered a lot as a result of human activities. And perhaps the most big instances generally all occurred in the early 80s. The first was that the main reef building, or the fastest growing reef building corals, the acroporids, the branching stag and elkhorn corals, got wiped out by disease, by white band disease in the early 80s. And about 98% of that coral was just wiped out across the region. So Caribbean reefs have never looked the same. Certainly through all my diving career, I've never got the chance to see them in that pristine state where these corals were so dominant. And you can see from this picture how important this coral is just for the whole ecosystem, how many fish are using this. There's schoolmaster snappers here, there's a porkfish, there's blue striped snappers, there's probably some blue striped grunts, there's sergeant majors, there's squirrelfish, there's a French grunt there, there's white grunts, there's a blue tang. Loads and loads of fish are relying on this ecosystem to provide them with shelter. And with these corals gone, they really don't have the way to live. And that's why it's so great to go to Cuba and see reefs with these corals intact and have a feel for what Caribbean reefs should be like. The white band disease that wiped out this has been traced back to a human gut bacteria, and actually it was probably untreated sewage being pumped into the Caribbean that created this disease. And in the times we live at the moment, it shows how valuable it is not to overexploit and take for granted the natural world, and our impact on it. The other great ecosystem that you can see in the Gardens of the Queen are the mangroves. And diving in the mangroves there, really, really fascinating. Packed with colour, packed with fish life. A lot of fish are sheltering in there, young fish and mature fish. And also just beautiful light. The way the light just spears down through the leaves is absolutely fantastic underwater. But I really wanted to focus this talk on just a few of my favourite macro subjects in there. It's so known and celebrated by underwater photographers as a big animal destination with sharks and crocs and groupers and all this amazing scenery. But actually, I love some of the Caribbean macro. And as a photographer, you tend to see so much macro photography being done in Asia. And the subjects of the Caribbean are very underexploited by photographers. There's less biodiversity in the Caribbean, but there's some really fascinating creatures. Some of them, really don't have counterparts in the Indo-Pacific reef system, and so you get the chance to shoot some really, really interesting and unusual animals. This is a banded cleaner shrimp, obviously a much more normal type of subject, but again, really, really cool creature. With these, just a few photo tips. I love shooting these guys with shallow depth of field. Generally, whenever I see them, I'll always open up my aperture. It helps just get rid of all the mess around them. So shoot them in that way. There's not tons and tons of nudibranchs and sea slugs in the Caribbean, but the ones there are, they're unique to the area. And I absolutely love these, and there are lots of these, particularly up in shallow areas in the Gardens of the Queen. This is a lettuce leaf sea slug. It's a sea slug, not a nudibranch. It's a herbivore. It eats algae and then farms the algae within its body, so it's kind of solar powered as well. And some of them are very white, but if you spend some time and find the right individuals, you can find really, really beautifully coloured ones like this one here. One of my favourite Caribbean little reef fish is the juvenile form of the spotted drum. That this fish is here. Really, really elegant little fish. Sort of constantly on the move, a little bit like juvenile sweetlips are in the Indo-Pacific. This beautiful long dorsal fin, really, really interesting, really, really cool fish. Great to shoot with snoots, these. They tend to stay near the bottom. You really want to highlight their shape, and so I tend to like to shoot them with snoots. Another really cool little Caribbean fish that you see regularly on the reefs are the slender filefish. Probably about the length of your thumb, so not tiny, tiny fish. And they tend to live in and around sea rods, sea plumes, sometimes around some of the longer rope sponges and things like that, you'll find them. Once you get your eye in for them, you can find them pretty much in every dive. And because they tend to be on the sea rods and sea plumes, often you find them if you're searching for things like flamingo tongues, you'll find these as well. So really cool critter to shoot. They tend to stay still, so you don't have to worry about them. They tend to stay around the same area. They can be a little bit shy, but if you spend some time with them, it's quite easy to get them facing onto the camera. One of my favourite subjects, though, in the Gardens of the Queen are the fairy basslets. Just the reef topography there with the mini walls and the main wall is just perfect habitat for them. So you can get them on every single dive, and they are an absolutely stunning fish. And they're definitely something that you should spend a couple of dives shooting, because they're just fantastic subjects to work with. Relatively approachable. I mean, they're to get close to. They live in little colonies of a larger male and a few smaller females. I generally try and focus my attention on the biggest fish, which tends to be the male, just because they're easier to photograph. And then you can spend time shooting them, either frame them against open water and get a nice black background, or play around with shallow depth of field as I have here, just to blur out the reef behind them, but still keep that feeling of the reef coming into the picture. This one load up. But they're really characterful fish and really nice to shoot. Sometimes you might see some interesting behaviour with them. They actually lay their eggs in holes in the reef. They live in little burrows or holes in the reef. They make burrows within the holes. And when it's mating time, the male goes out and he picks up all nice bits of fresh algae growing around his territory and takes them back inside the hole. And then all the different females in the harem will come in and lay their eggs, and they stick them onto this algae. So this is a male collecting algae and then swimming back into his hole, stuffing it in, and then he'd come out and collect another piece and stuff it back in his hole. And then after that, the female would go inside the hole with him and lay the eggs on the algae. But what's great about fairy basslets in Cuba is Cuba has its own endemic version of a fairy basslet, which is the golden basslet, which was described officially in 2010 by Jack Randall, who was one of the authors on the paper who died this week. Jack Randall, the great fish biologist. I have to say, I'm not completely convinced it is a separate species. I've not got anything like Jack Randall's expertise on these things. But watching them living on the reefs, they tend to live mixed in with the normal fairy basslets, which suggests to me that they're just a colour variety of a normal fairy basslet. But they're only in Cuba. They're beautiful golden fish and really, really fantastic to see. Really worth seeking out on the dives there, because it's the only place in the world you can shoot this amazing golden basslet. And if you're really lucky, you might even find a hybridized form, which is a mix between a golden basslet and a normal fairy basslet. You can see that it's got some purple on its head, but not the full purple of a normal fairy basslet. And this is a hybrid, a mix between the two species. Or if, like me, you think they're perhaps not all, they're just colour varieties, it's a mix between the two colour varieties. Sorry, my email's going off there. But fairy bass is absolutely fantastic fish. A couple of other things I need to highlight. There's some amazing blennies. Arrow blennies, one of the coolest little blennies around, have a very different face to any other blenny. They have this long pointed nose because they're a streamlined hunter. And they have this long pointed nose so that they swim over the reef with their tail cocked round, a bit like an umbrella. And then when they get close enough to their prey, usually small shrimps and crustaceans living on the reef, they flick that tail forward. It sends the streamlined body darting forward, and they can grab their prey. They're really cool little creatures. You can find them in tubes. They do live in tubes as well, in holes, but much nicer to shoot them when they're out and about and swimming around. They tend to like little overhang areas towards the bottom of the mini wall is a great place to search for them. So a dive site with a nice sharp mini wall, bit of an overhang, you'll always find arrow blennies in there. And then one of the favourite groups for photographers are the secretary blennies or tube blennies that live in tubes on the reef. And they're a common species across the Caribbean. You can find them in all sorts of different habitats and take different pictures of them. But they're nicest, I think, in Cuba. And there's a couple of different types, actually. The previous one was a spiny head blenny. This one here now with the orange eyes is a rough head blenny. They're really quite small. They definitely need a good strong diopter to shoot them nice and big in the frame. But for me, it's always about finding them living in interesting places, nice, colourful backgrounds. And one of the things I love about Cuba, and I've not seen this in other parts of the Caribbean, but I've not dived everywhere in the Caribbean, is they tend to live on old worm tubes that have grown on old bits of Gorgonian that have died back. The worms have colonised them. Then when the worms have gone, the secretary blennies take over this is spiny head blenny, takes over the old worm tube as a place to live. And then often that worm tube that whole thing gets encrusted with sponge, so you get the chance to shoot them on these amazingly colourful backgrounds, which I've not found regularly in other parts of the world, but in Cuba you can find them all the time on these colourful backgrounds. And if you wait for a few seconds, you'll get them opening their mouths, yawning, doing lots of great things. So that's my final picture. And just to finish off, I was going to show you a 30-second video that takes me straight back to the Gardens of the Queen, enjoying life there. And I just sped it. I just sped up the second part of the video here of us going through the mangroves, so you can see us racing back home after a day's diving. I'm sure this takes lots of you back there. I just ran it at double speed, so it doesn't take quite so long to see. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into my love of diving in the Gardens of the Queen. Thanks very much.